For decades, the Ramsey family has denied any involvement in the crime. But what if I told you there's one detail that could change everything? Something that was always there, yet never examined closely enough. Today, we're diving into that revelation to see if this might be the moment when the JonBenét case finally takes a definitive turn. For decades, everyone looked at this case the same way. Ramsey's denying involvement, the police split between the intruder theory and the idea that the killer was already inside the house, and sensational headlines turning the tragedy into a spectacle. But what if I told you that, while the whole world kept debating the same old questions, one essential piece of the puzzle was completely overlooked? The murder of JonBenét wasn't just a mystery, it became a labyrinth where every clue led to a dead end. Amid all the theories, accusations, and speculations, one crucial detail went unnoticed. Something that was always there, in the case files, in the forensic reports, in the testimonies, but never given the weight it deserved. Now, this new evidence doesn't just reignite the mystery, it changes everything. Because if it's confirmed, we're not talking about just a clue. We might have the definitive answer to one of the most enigmatic crimes in history. The lingering question is, why did this information never come to light before? Was it negligence? A genuine misstep in the investigation? Or perhaps someone knew more than they let on and preferred to keep it buried? Whatever the answer, one thing is for sure. If that detail had been taken seriously from the start, we might be talking about this case in a completely different way today. We always hear that the first hours of an investigation are the most crucial. The faster the police act, the better the chance of solving the crime. But what if I told you that in JonBenét's case, time wasn't just wasted, it might have even been manipulated? The focus of the investigation shifted several times over the years. First, all eyes were on the parents and the brother Burke. Then the intruder theory gained steam thanks to some unknown DNA found at the scene. But now with our current technology and knowledge, we realize that something essential was missed. That detail which could change everything was always there, but it was never properly explored. And the reason for that might lie in how the investigation was handled from day one. The Ramsey house was never treated like a standard crime scene. The police allowed family friends to come and go as they pleased. There wasn't an immediate, thorough forensic sweep of every room. When JonBenét was found in the basement, her body was moved, carried in the arms of her own father before investigators could properly examine it. All of this might seem like mistakes, carelessness, or a lack of experience on the part of the Boulder police. But what if it isn't? What if these mistakes were actually pieces in a much larger game? Because now, looking at this case with fresh eyes, we realize it wasn't just the evidence that was overlooked, it was the truth itself. This new evidence could change everything. But here's a bigger problem. If this clue has been there for years, why did no one dig deeper? The answer might lie in how the case was handled from the very beginning. When the police arrived at the Ramsey house, they encountered a wealthy, influential family with powerful friends. Unlike other cases where suspects are immediately pressured, the approach here was completely different. The Ramseys had time to prepare. They even hired lawyers before giving any formal statements. For months, they refused to speak directly with investigators, and when they finally did, they already had a well-rehearsed narrative. Meanwhile, evidence was getting lost, reports were incomplete, and crucial details were ignored. Now comes the most unsettling question. Did someone want this investigation to never reach a conclusion? Because if this evidence is real, it means someone was there that night. Someone left a trace, and someone might have been protected all along. And if that's true, then the murder of JonBenét isn't just one of the most famous unsolved mysteries. It could be one of the biggest cover-ups in modern criminal history. So here's the big question. Now that this information has come to light, will we finally get the truth, or will it be buried once again? That Christmas night, the Ramsey house was quiet. Outside, festive lights still twinkled, reflecting off untouched snow. Inside, everything appeared normal. Open presents, leftover food on the table, and the low hum of the TV playing downstairs. To any outsider, it was just another night of celebration for an ordinary family. But behind those walls, something was about to happen. Something that would forever change how just after 9 that night. That was the last time anyone officially saw her alive. Hours later, at 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey called the police in a panic. There on the staircase lay the ransom note, 3 handwritten pages demanding exactly $118,000 for the safe return of the girl. A very specific amount that, strangely enough, matched John Ramsey's annual bonus. The police arrived within minutes, but they found no signs of forced entry. No footprints in the snow outside, no broken windows, nothing to suggest that a kidnapper had actually entered the home. Meanwhile, the Ramseys' behavior was unusual. There was no frantic search inside the house for their daughter. There was no reluctance to let friends and neighbors enter, touch things, and mingle with the crime scene. It wasn't until around noon that John Ramsey finally went down to the basement. And there she was, JonBenét, lying face down, partially covered by a white blanket, with a rope around her neck, her wrists tied, and tape over her mouth. The sight of her own father holding his lifeless daughter should have been the most heart-wrenching moment of the day. But something about the way he carried her, the way he reacted, raised many suspicions. The investigation should have started right there. Instead, that was the moment when everything fell apart. The police didn't secure the scene properly. The body was moved before a full forensic examination could take place. Evidence was compromised. And while the officers were trying to figure out what was happening, the Ramseys were making calls, first to friends, then to lawyers. Just 6 hours after the initial call to the police, JonBenét was dead. The case had already turned into a circus. And what could have been a meticulous investigation turned into one of the biggest disasters in U.S. criminal history. Now, as we look back, we see something that no one clearly noticed at the time. Something that wasn't in the ransom note, nor in the inconsistencies of the testimonies, nor in the police mistakes. Something that was always there, but never examined properly. Over the years, a lot has been said about the ransom note, the lack of any signs of forced entry, and the family's strange behavior. But few noticed one small, extremely significant detail that could have completely changed the course of the investigation from the start. A DNA sample was found at the crime scene, small but present, on JonBenét's body, on the pajamas she was wearing, on the underwear that investigators collected. And for years, that evidence was dismissed as irrelevant. At the time, they justified it by saying the sample didn't match anyone in the family. And for some, that was enough to take John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey off the suspect list. But what almost no one realized is that this assumption doesn't add up. Throughout history, many criminals left partial DNA samples that were only identified decades later with advances in forensic technology. So here's the most important question. Why was this clue never taken as seriously as it deserved? If this DNA sample belonged to someone from outside the house, why didn't the police focus all their efforts on finding a match? And if it belonged to someone inside, why wasn't it re-examined with today's far more advanced techniques compared to those of 1996? This evidence was always there, always in the reports, in the case files, in the forgotten records. But the way this case was conducted from the very beginning prevented it from being properly explored. And now, more than 20 years later, this might be the key to finally understanding what happened that night. But can the truth still come to light after all this time? Or has it been buried along with the case, the evidence, and the unanswered questions? Inside the Boulder police station, the room was silent. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, the atmosphere was stifling. Documents were scattered across the table, photos of the basement, the ransom note, the autopsy report. Investigators reviewed everything again and again, but nothing made sense. Then one of the experts pointed to a detail that no one had really paid much attention to before. Something small, almost insignificant, but that could change everything. A DNA sample found on JonBenét's underwear. This doesn't belong to anyone in the family, one expert said. But then, whose does it belong to? This fragment of genetic material was tested back then, but the results didn't lead to any match. In 1996, forensic databases were limited, and advances in genetic genealogy were still a long way off. The police didn't have the resources to dig deeper. The case cooled off, and this piece of evidence was practically forgotten. But now, more than 2 decades later, technology has changed. Forensic science has evolved to the point of solving crimes that were once considered useless, can now lead to definitive answers. And here's the most disturbing question. If this evidence has always been there, why was no one ever serious about investigating it? The answer might lie in what happened in the early days of the investigation. The Boulder police were under pressure from all sides. The media turned the case into a spectacle, and the Ramseys had connections that few homicide suspects ever have. The house was never treated like a standard crime scene. Investigators came and went without gloves at times, mishandled evidence, and when JonBenét's body was found, protocol was completely ignored. John Ramsey picked up his daughter's body before the initial forensic examination. The tape covering her mouth was removed and discarded. The blanket covering her was folded and moved. Each of these details could have wiped out crucial clues, And meanwhile, that tiny DNA fragment remained, a key piece that was ignored. Now, more than 20 years later, analyzing this genetic material might finally lead to an answer. But that possibility raises an even more intriguing question. If today's technology can reveal the identity of the owner of that DNA, it means the truth was within reach all along. So why was it never taken seriously? Maybe the explanation is simple. Nobody wanted this truth to come out. If the DNA sample belonged to a stranger, an intruder, it would mean that the whole narrative blaming the family was a huge mistake. And that would put the police and the media in a very awkward position. After all, for years, all suspicions were focused on the Ramseys. The idea of an outsider criminal was always met with skepticism. But what if the DNA belonged to someone already involved in the investigation? Someone who went unnoticed? Someone who was never even considered a suspect? Because if this DNA sample is finally analyzed with the proper tools, only two scenarios are possible. Either it confirms the family's innocence by pointing to an outsider, or it reveals a name no one ever imagined. And if that's the case, and then maybe the truth was hidden all these years, not by mistake, but on purpose. The truth, when it finally emerges, is rarely what we expect. In the case of JonBenét Ramsey, it was hidden for years, lost in assumptions, theories, and inconclusive investigations. But now, with the one clue that never received the proper attention, we reach the decisive moment. What does this evidence really mean? Who left that trace of DNA? And why was that information never used to find a culprit? For years, investigators focused on the usual elements: the ransom note, the inconsistencies in the Ramseys' testimonies, the poorly preserved crime scene. But while all eyes were on those points, the one concrete piece of evidence that could have led to a definitive answer was ignored. The DNA fragment found on JonBenét's clothing could have been analyzed with modern techniques. It could have been compared to updated databases, but it wasn't. And that raises two possibilities. Either it was a grave mistake, one of those oversights that happens when the police are lost in a complex case, or it was something much worse, an intentional silence. Now imagine if that sample were finally tested properly, that the new genetic genealogy techniques reveal a name, someone never mentioned before, someone who was around all along. If that happens, the impact will be enormous, because it means that the truth wasn't just ignored, it was actively hidden. So what happens next? Time waits for no one. If this clue had been taken seriously from the start, JonBenét might have had justice years ago. Instead, the case dragged on, files were shelved, and the story turned into one of those dark legends that seem to go on forever. Now, with advances in forensic science, the possibility of an answer is closer than ever. But there's something curious. The closer we get to the truth, the more resistance we face. Because this investigation isn't just about figuring out who was in that house that night. It also questions how the case was handled from the very beginning. If a name emerges from this new analysis, the inevitable question will be, why wasn't this person considered earlier? What else might have been overlooked? And more importantly, who benefited from keeping quiet? If this detail is finally investigated the right way, the JonBenét case could change completely. What was once an eternal mystery might soon lead to the identification of a culprit. But the truth comes at a price. And if this evidence was kept buried for so long, it's because someone had a vested interest in keeping it that way. The police might reopen the case. The media might start talking about it again, and experts could push for new analyses. But the lingering question remains, will the truth be accepted? Or even with all the proof, will some still prefer to keep something scarier than not knowing the answer? Knowing it and choosing to ignore it. The truth has a strange way of hiding where we least expect it. For years, the JonBenét case was stifled by speculation, mistakes, and distractions. But now, with the one clue that never received its due attention, we're faced with an impossible question to ignore. Did someone at some point choose to keep this truth buried? This wouldn't be the first time a case was lost, not because of a lack of evidence, but because of a lack of interest in solving it. We've seen it before. Crimes shelved for decades, only to be solved when someone dared to ask, what if we missed something? Now history is repeating itself. Technology has advanced. The forgotten DNA might finally point us to an answer. But do the people involved really want to hear that answer? If this evidence is properly tested and it leads us to a name, it won't just be a breakthrough for the JonBenét case. It'll be a shock to everything we thought we knew about investigations, justice, and influence. Because if this clue was always there, it means the solution was within reach all along. But will it happen? After years of silence and omissions, will the truth finally be accepted? Looking back at everything we've discussed, it's clear that this isn't an ordinary case. We're not just talking about a brutal crime, we're talking about an entire system that, in one way or another, failed. An investigation that started off on the wrong foot and was never corrected. What do I think? To me, the truth is already there. It always has been. We just need someone with the courage to see it, and more importantly, to act on it. And that leads to another question. How many other cases might be in the same situation? If JonBenét still hasn't received justice, how many other victims have had their stories buried for convenience? If you've stuck with me this far, comment, "The truth doesn't stay hidden forever," to let me know you're on this quest with me. I want to hear your opinion. Can this new evidence really change everything? Or is this case doomed to remain unsolved? And if you want to understand how a single detail can reopen a case after years, don't miss the next video. We're going to talk about an investigation that seemed hopeless, until a tiny fragment of DNA changed everything. You've got to see this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss this and other cases that justice almost let slip away. The truth is out there, and we're going to keep looking for it.